So, just a simple observation I've made over the past few years. Without humility and honesty, nothing new happens. Humility and honesty, they are the foundation to our connection with God and everything meaningful. But these virtues never come easily, do they? In fact, most of us have to crawl our way back to them. It's that point of surrender, and it can be such a long, hard, painful process. Because it's that process of admitting that we're wrong, or it's maybe the process of saying sorry, or it's the process of admitting that things have become unmanageable, or the process of admitting that we don't have all the answers, that we don't know how to do it, or it's the process of admitting that we've been trying to be someone we're not. Ultimately, I think it's the process of turning our will and our lives over to the care of God. And dang, this can be one of the hardest things we can do. And it's painful because lots of us, lots of the time, we like to hold on to our lives pretty tightly, don't we? Let me hold on tighter. Give me a little more control, and I can make this thing work. Let me have a little more time to control this thing, and I'll make it work. For the past few years, I've been going through the 12 steps, been working with the 12 steps. And the 9th step tells us that we are to make amends with people that we might have harmed along the way. Talk about hard. And, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but sometimes you can be working a process, and you can think to yourself, oh man, I've got all that taken care of, moving on. And then something from your past creeps up. And this thing from your past, it says, you got to deal with me. Oh no, I've already dealt with you, I'm good, we're good. No, you've got to deal with me. You've got to deal with me, and in that moment that you actually have to deal with it. You actually have to face it. And so I was meeting with a friend yesterday for breakfast, and I was telling him all the reasons I didn't want to deal with this one. Not this one. And I said, if I turn this thing over, hand over my will on this one, I don't know the outcomes. I don't know how this is going to go. And we love to control outcomes, don't we? If I hand this thing over, I don't know what the future looks like. If I take a step in this direction, I don't know the next step to take. And that's scary. Who wants to start a process when you don't even know the next step? You don't know what it's going to look like. And why is it? Why are we so quick to jump to the future? On Thursday nights, Tammy, my wife, and I, we've been leading this group called Pause, where we've just been having people over on our back patio. Just for Thursdays in July, we've been talking about what it means to pause in our lives and to actually be aware and to pay attention to the moments that matter most, the most meaningful moments, which, by the way, are usually the most simple moments. And why is it so hard for us to stay present? This is what we talked about last Thursday with a group of people. Why is it so hard to stay present in the moment? Why do we want to jump to the future? Why is it so difficult to truly live one day at a time? Hard, isn't it? And I suspect that anytime there's uncertainty, we cling even tighter. We hold things tighter. Whether it's a cancer diagnosis or an amends you're dealing with, a broken relationship, or a son or daughter who's maybe gone on a wayward path, and you just want to hold a little tighter. If I can hold it tighter, I can control this. Give me a little more time to control it, and I can make it go. And all of this leads us to this question that we're wrestling with this morning. If we can put it on the screen, please. Would you give yourself to humility, honesty, and surrender if you knew that nothing but love and mercy was awaiting you on the other side? So let's look at some scripture, shall we? Because this scripture gives us a new and different kind of language for it, and I think it's fascinating. Mark chapter 8. Here's how the text reads. After calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them, All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? Other translations read it as, what good is it to gain the world but lose your soul? And then verse 37, what will people give in exchange for their lives? Now, when we come across a text like this or a passage like this, I think our job is to ask it all sorts of questions. Ask it the hardest questions, your best questions. Be honest with your questions, because when we are, that's the place I think we find God. That's where things are revealed. And in fact, if you're at a point in your faith journey or in your life where you have all sorts of doubts, good. Embrace those doubts, because doubt lets you know that your faith is alive and active and kicking. Your faith actually has a pulse to it. So as I was looking at this text over the past couple of weeks, I wrote down some questions. You might have a different set of questions. Here's some of my questions. Jesus, what do you mean when you say to deny ourselves or to say no to ourselves? Other versions say to renounce yourselves. What do you mean by this? Because in our culture, we live currently in this culture of shame where lots and lots of people walk around carrying shame. And I want to tread lightly when we start telling people to say no to themselves and deny themselves. What do you mean by this, Jesus? And what do you mean when you tell us to take up your cross? What does that mean? Because if you're telling us just to suffer for suffering's sake, I'm not really interested. And if you're telling us, Jesus, just to suffer for death's sake, I'm not interested in that either. And remember, this didn't end well for you. And Jesus, you call this thing good news. Come on. How is this good news? Where's the good news? And is it possible for me to hold tightly and still keep my life, still keep my soul, still keep my sanity? And all of these questions, I believe it's actually what makes this text, this passage, fascinating. Because how does Jesus talk about real life? How does Jesus talk about good news? He starts with death. He starts with death. When the Bible tells the primary story of God bringing life into the world, how does that story go? Jesus' life, Jesus dies on a cross, rises again. This is the way the world works. Death is the engine to life, and it's like Jesus is saying, don't you get this? This is the way it is, man. Don't you get it? I mean, think of something simple like food. Death, or life, death, life. Think of the example of an apple. When an apple grows on a tree, someone has to disconnect that apple from the tree, disconnect it from its life source. That apple is then eaten. It goes in your body and gives you fuel. It literally sustains you. It gives you life. How did this tree get there? Well, a seed, life, had to go into the ground, death, into the depths of darkness. And then something new came up. Life, death, new life. Fascinating, isn't it? Death is the engine to life. Take up your cross. It's about death so that something new can live. What's the central message of Jesus? Jesus teaches us how to die so that we can actually have life. All the things that keep us from humility and honesty, all the things that keep us from real life, Jesus invites these parts of us to die. The parts that are always consumed by fear. The parts that always want to compare ourselves to others or tear others down so that we can lift ourselves up. The parts that crave power and control. The parts that always have to be right. Jesus invites these parts of ourselves to die so that something new can live. Lose your life in order to find it. But you know this takes a bit of humility, honesty, and surrender, doesn't it? And so let me pose the question again. Would you give yourself to humility, honesty, and surrender if you knew nothing but love and mercy was awaiting you on the other side. And see, here's the problem. We live in that culture of shame. And I'm not sure we actually believe love and mercy is truly waiting on the other side. And so we approach this thing through the means of shame and sacrifice. Oh, if I could just do something more. If I could just be more. If I could just be enough, then they would really like me. Then I would really fit in. Then I would have a sense of belonging. And then you see how we project that on God. Oh, God, if I could just be enough. Oh, God, look at how good I am. Look at everything I've sacrificed for you. Look at how busy I am. Aren't I valuable? And the truth is, this too needs to die. But it's not because of guilt and shame and sacrifice. Over and over in the scriptures, we see a God who says, don't you get it? I don't need your sacrifices. I don't want them. You guys may need them, but I don't need them. Remember the prophets, Amos and Micah. And it's like God saying, I don't even like your festivals, your music, your gatherings. I don't like them because your heart's not in it. You want to know what I want? I want things like justice. I want you to live differently. I want your heart. And then you get that story in Genesis where Abraham does something so silly as to start to sacrifice his own son. And remember what God says? No, don't do it. I don't need that. You thought I needed it, but I don't need that. And then when we get to Jesus, Jesus is absolutely relentless against the leaders who go around teaching people that it's about sacrificing more and more in order to get to God. Especially when it comes to the temple system, a system that actually hurts the poor because you had to buy a sacrifice and then take that sacrifice in the temple and sacrifice it. Jesus is relentless against this. When did we become so deceived that we actually believed we were loved for how good enough we were, how moral enough, how righteous enough, how enough we were? The truth is, God is already pleased with you. There is nothing more you can do to get God to love you more. God is already pleased with you. It's the beauty about the story of Jesus' baptism. Do you remember it? Early in Mark's gospel, Jesus hadn't done anything yet. Mark chapter 1, hadn't done anything yet. In fact, in many people's eyes, he was probably just another nobody, another person on the margins, not known. And remember, he goes down to the Jordan River. John the baptizer puts him in the water, brings him up. And do you know what God said to him? You are my son, whom I love dearly. In you I find happiness. If we could put it in our vernacular, we might say, God said to Jesus, that's my boy. That's my boy. If we start measuring love by how much we could do or how much we could give, we would all fall pretty short, wouldn't we? We'd all be in quite a mess. Speaking of not doing anything, you know who hasn't done anything lately? If I can get the next slide, please. This little guy. Breck came into our lives 4.5 months ago. And so far, he has done a terrible job at pulling his weight in the family. He hasn't done one dish. He hasn't contributed to household chores in any way. He still can't change his own diapers. Still needs a food source, can't feed himself. You see, if we measured love by what he could do, he'd be at the very bottom, wouldn't he? But y'all know this isn't true. Why do we love Breck? Because he's our son. Because he is. Because he came into the world. He didn't do anything. He just is. He's my boy. He's my boy. And sometimes I think we have the easiest jobs in the world. Because my job is to remind you, and your job is to remind me, when God looks at you, what God sees. And when God looks at you, God says, him, right there, that's my boy. You see her? Right there, she's my girl. She is my girl. And he's my boy. And she's my girl. Do you believe it? Is it possible that you're holding on so tightly to your life that you're actually losing it? And would you give yourself to humility, honesty, and surrender if you knew that nothing but love and mercy was awaiting you on the other side? Have you ever been to that point of surrender, turning things over? Or have you been with someone on their journey of surrender? And if you have, you know that these are holy, sacred moments. I have a voicemail on my phone. It's been there for over a year now, and I keep it. It's a voicemail from my friend, and he's telling me that 2 nights prior, he made some major mistakes. And on the voicemail, he's telling me that he's ready to deal with these and to own these. But he says, Ryan, I've got to be honest with you. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, and I'm sad, and I'm scared. He says, it feels like I'm dying. And the truth is, surrender will always feel like dying. And yet, it's the necessary path to liberation. You see, we start with death. And when we start with death, we realize just how fragile life is. And when we start with death, we realize just how holy and sacred this moment is. And we actually become more and more aware of the gift of this thing called life. Jesus teaches us how to die so that we might actually live. Richard Rohr, one of my favorite theologians and favorite authors, he wrote a book called Breathing Underwater, and here's how he put it. If I can have the slide, there we go. He says, we suffer to get well. We surrender to win. We die to live. We give it away to keep it. If you remember back to the beginning of the service, we started with a scene from Flight, and it was the scene of surrender. Humility, honesty, and surrender. He loses it all. But now we go to the scene of liberation. And let me remind you, surrender doesn't mean you're free of consequences. There might actually be some consequences that you have to deal with, but I am absolutely convinced surrender always leads to freedom. Take a look.